In this edition of Ask the Expert, I'm speaking with Lesley-Anne Morgan from Schroders about the expectations that people have in retirement versus the reality and how adequate planning can help to bridge this gap. So Lesley-Anne, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, we're talking about retirement and investing in retirement. Now, what do retirees need to think about when they're preparing their investment portfolio as they're approaching retirement and the end of work?
I think there's quite a few questions that people need to be asking themselves. They need to be thinking about how much income they're going to be needing in retirement. So that covers basic living expenses and other things that they'd like to do with their money. And further out, they need to think about aged care and other things that they may spend their money on as they get very elderly. In terms of their investment portfolio, they need to really consider whether or not they've got enough in their account. And if they don't have enough in their account, they need to think about whether or not they've got enough growth assets in their portfolio, because people are living longer than they ever used to live. So if they're underfunded and they're living longer, they probably need more growth assets than maybe they expected. Understanding the impact of inflation is really important, and actually inflation on medical expenses and inflation on aged care is usually much higher than regular inflation. So people really need to think about that, and it's often not something that people do think about, especially when it may be more than 20 years away when you're going to go into aged care. So planning for that as part of your whole pension provision is important. And it's tough. It's a thing that people often don't want to think about, but they should be thinking about.
In terms of the investment portfolio, and how does the approach that people make shift when they're moving from, say, that accumulation phase of their investing years through to the drawdown period when they're actually finishing work and they're wanting to draw that income?
Yeah. So actually, the investment portfolios often don't need to differ very much at all. They still need some growth in them, as I've already mentioned already. But actually having that kind of objective-based inflation plus type of approach to investing works really well just before retirement and also into retirement as well. But importantly, people need to start to worry about whether or not they're going to get some big losses in their portfolio. So when they get into retirement, they need a manager or a portfolio that actually really thinks about some of those losses and manages those losses quite well, so that if you suffer a very large loss when you first retire, you're obviously going to have less income in retirement. So you want to try and avoid that when you get into retirement.
You've mentioned something about the retirement funding gap. What is this gap, and how can people actually seek to close that?
Yeah, so the funding gap is the difference between how much you think you're going to need in retirement versus how much you will have predicted to have saved by the time you get to retirement. So if you have a few years to go before you get to retirement, one of the best ways is obviously to try and save a bit more. And we're hearing a lot about people wanting to save more at the moment to be able to deal with that issue. If you're very close to retirement, then obviously saving more is going to be a bit difficult, or it might be that it isn't going to make that much difference. So once you get into retirement, investing really carefully to make as much return as you can without taking too much risk is going to be one of the better ways to kind of break that, the gap between what you need and what you expect to have saved.
And what do you generally find? Do people underestimate how much they're going to need? Do they overestimate, or are they living more frugally than they perhaps anticipated they would be able to?
Well, it's not a particularly clear message in Australia, actually. There's been lots of evidence to show that people are living frugally in retirement, but it's not clear whether or not that's actually kind of the generation that's in retirement at the moment, or whether they're actually having to live frugally because they haven't got enough to retire on. Some evidence of a research study that we did at Schroders recently shows that people really underestimate how much they're going to have to spend on their basic living expenses. This was much higher than expected, and as a result, people were having to cut back on the fun things that they really wanted to do in retirement. So having to cut back on their hobbies and cut back on doing some of the other things that they'd look forward to doing in retirement. So really understanding how much of your total account is going to be used on utility bills, just heating, or looking after yourself in retirement, feeding yourself in retirement is important. You need to understand that before you start to think about how you spend all the rest of your money that hopefully you've saved up and looking forward to retirement to spending.
I think those complexities is part of the reason why there is such a big message for the importance of people getting financial advice, and that's why so many people do speak to an advisor for the first time only once they're pretty close to retirement.
Yeah, I mean, getting advice, particularly for people who are likely to be means tested through the age pension, is important, because understanding that interaction between your investments and the age pension is important to work out how much income you're actually going to have to live on.
Any advice in this video is general advice prepared by Morningstar without reference to your financial objectives, situation or needs. You should consider the advice in light of these matters and any relevant product disclosure statement before making any decision to invest.